Summer of 1943, in the rolling hills of Tennessee, far from the deserts of North Africa and the shattered cities of Europe, a German soldier stood staring at a glass bottle. Inside it, a brown liquid hissed softly, alive with bubbles. He turned it in his hands, watching the carbonation rise and break against the glass. He had never seen anything like it. The label read Coca-Cola. For 2 years he had fought across Libya and Tunisia, living on hard bread, thin soup, and bitter ersatz coffee. Sugar was a memory. Milk was a rumor. Chocolate belonged to childhood, long before the war. Now, in an American prison camp, a guard told him this drink cost 5 cents, the same price American children paid with spare change. Not a reward, not a luxury, just an everyday thing. Across the United States that summer, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war were discovering a reality that collided head-on with everything they had been taught to believe. Nazi propaganda had promised that America was soft, decadent, divided, incapable of sustained sacrifice. What they found instead was not weakness, but abundance, so routine it bordered on careless. Ice cream appeared at meals. Candy bars were sold casually at camp exchanges. Soft drinks were stacked in crates, as common as water. These were not propaganda displays or special treatment for foreign observers. This was normal American life, barely adjusted for wartime, and for men who came from a society of ration cards and empty shelves, it was psychologically devastating. The journey into captivity began months earlier, in May 1943, when the Afrika Korps collapsed in Tunisia. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. Hardened veterans who had chased the British across the desert now laid down their weapons, expecting revenge, starvation, and humiliation. They had been warned that American captivity would be brutal, that they would be worked to death or left to rot. Instead, within hours of surrender, American trucks rolled in, carrying field rations. The men who opened those packages stared in disbelief. Crackers, processed cheese, fruit bars, sugar tablets, cigarettes, candy coffee that actually tasted like coffee. American soldiers complained about these rations endlessly, but to Germans who had lived for months on shrinking portions, they were feasts. At processing camps, prisoners were served pancakes with syrup, fresh eggs, and milk. Foods that had vanished from German military life years earlier were being handed out to defeated enemies. This was not kindness born of sentiment, it was logistics. The United States Army fed prisoners the same way it fed itself, at scale, with industrial efficiency. Calories were calculated, supply chains were standardized, refrigeration was assumed, not improvised. The psychological impact was immediate, even if its meaning would take time to sink in. One German officer later told Red Cross investigators that the confusion was more disturbing than hunger would have been. If America could afford to feed its enemies this well, then everything they had believed about American weakness was wrong. That lesson deepened during the Atlantic crossing. Liberty ships, the blunt-hulled cargo vessels that became the backbone of Allied logistics, carried thousands of prisoners across the ocean each month. Built faster than German submarines could sink them, these ships were symbols of industrial warfare. At peak production, one was completed every 42 hours. They were ugly, functional, and everywhere. On board, prisoners received rations equal to or better than those of the crews. Fresh bread, meat, vegetables, coffee, with sugar and milk. Refrigeration systems kept food from spoiling during the 2-week crossing, and on more than one occasion, ice cream appeared. Ship logs confirm it. On July 4, 1943, aboard the USS General M.B. Stewart, prisoners were served ice cream produced by the ship's onboard machine, 10 gallons at a time, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. For men who had not seen ice cream since before the war, the experience defied comprehension. Frozen dessert served to enemy prisoners during a global conflict on a mass-produced transport ship. When the vessels docked at ports like Norfolk and Newport News, the education continued. German prisoners glimpsed the American war machine at work. Norfolk Naval Base alone covered thousands of acres, handling more cargo in a day than major German ports managed in a week. Dockside exchanges overflowed with goods. Candy bars from multiple manufacturers, cigarettes by the carton, soft drinks stacked high, all priced cheaply, all available without ceremony. 5 cents bought chocolate, 5 cents bought Coca-Cola. The same price paid everywhere in the country. The train ride inland shattered another illusion. Instead of boxcars or cattle wagons, prisoners traveled in passenger coaches. Dining cars served full meals, fried chicken, vegetables, pie, and coffee. It was not a show arranged for prisoners. This was standard American rail service. Ordinary civilians ate the same food, in the same cars, for the same prices. By the time they arrived at camps like Crossville, Tennessee, the realization was unavoidable. America was not suffering the way Germany was. The camps themselves exceeded international requirements. Electric lighting, hot water, heated barracks, flush toilets. But it was the camp exchanges that delivered the final blow. The PX stores stocked multiple brands of soft drinks, candy bars in rows, ice cream where refrigeration allowed, fresh fruit, cigarettes, even beer. Weak by German standards but astonishing in its availability. Prisoners were paid for their labor, initially 80 cents a day, later a full dollar. At 5 cents per item, a day's wages bought an abundance that bordered on absurd. 16 candy bars, 16 bottles of Coca-Cola, or a mixture of everything. In Germany, such goods were rationed, unavailable, or reserved for elites. In America, they were cheap, standardized, and democratic. Coca-Cola became the symbol that tied it all together. Before capture, most German soldiers had never tasted it. Now, it was everywhere. Company records show that in 1943 alone, 5 billion bottles were produced. The US military guaranteed the 5-cent price for servicemen worldwide, a promise that required enormous logistical coordination. Syrup concentrate, produced in Atlanta, was shipped across the continent to thousands of bottling plants, each delivering identical taste and quality. Prisoners noticed this immediately. A bottle opened in Tennessee tasted exactly like one opened in Texas or Maine. For technically minded soldiers raised on German engineering pride, this level of standardization was unsettling. Nazi ideology claimed American industry was chaotic and inefficient. Coca-Cola proved the opposite. It was precision disguised as leisure. Camps received weekly deliveries by the hundreds of cases. At Camp Hearn in Texas, consumption reached thousands of bottles a week. Prisoners watched Americans discard half-empty bottles without thought. Sugar, glass, labor, all wasted casually. Not because Americans were ignorant of scarcity, but because scarcity did not define their lives. Ice cream carried the lesson even further. In Germany, ice cream had vanished with the war. Milk was rationed, sugar was rare, refrigeration was limited. In American camps, ice cream appeared regularly during summer months. The army considered it essential for morale, important enough to justify specialized production. Hand-cranked freezers turned out gallons on hot afternoons. Later, electric machines made it routine. Chocolate, vanilla, strawberry, flavors that exceeded what German ice cream parlors offered even before the war. Prisoners could buy ice cream sandwiches or bars for pocket change. The casual use of ice cream and sugar for entertainment food was incomprehensible to men whose families survived on measured grams. Sugar itself delivered one of the most powerful shocks. In Germany, it was strictly rationed. In American camps, bowls of it sat openly on tables, unlimited. Coffee was sweetened freely. Cakes and pies appeared on menus. When several 100 pounds of sugar hardened in humid Alabama weather and were thrown away rather than salvaged, German prisoners working in the kitchen were visibly distressed. Waste on that scale was unthinkable where they came from. Chocolate told a similar story. Multiple brands, multiple varieties, preferences rather than necessity determined choice. Red Cross packages added more: coffee, cheese, candy, cigarettes. These parcels, meant to supplement already generous rations, often exceeded what German civilians received as their primary food supply. By the end of 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Enemy prisoners in America ate better than civilians in Germany. This was not accidental. It was the byproduct of a society organized around mass production rather than extraction, around abundance rather than control. Every meal became a lesson, every Coca-Cola a data point, every ice cream sundae an argument no speech could defeat. The men who arrived expecting brutality instead encountered prosperity so deep it could be shared with enemies, and once that truth was tasted, it could never be untasted. As the months passed, captivity became an extended education rather than an interlude of suffering. By late 1943, German prisoners were no longer shocked by individual meals or treats. The shock had evolved into something deeper: pattern recognition. Abundance was not occasional, it was structural. It appeared everywhere, across regions, seasons, and institutions. And it was consistent. Thanksgiving arrived in November, bringing with it a revelation that went far beyond food. Across every American prison camp, the same meal was served on the same day: roast turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and gravy, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, vegetables, pumpkin pie, coffee, and milk. This was not a symbolic gesture or a diplomatic display. It was the same Thanksgiving dinner served to American soldiers, sailors, and civilians nationwide. The logistical implications stunned prisoners who understood military supply. Providing identical holiday meals to hundreds of thousands of enemy captives, while simultaneously feeding millions of servicemen around the world, required an organizational capacity Germany could not match even in peacetime. That German prisoners received this meal without distinction shattered the racial hierarchy embedded in Nazi ideology. Equality at the dinner table was not theoretical, it was practiced. Christmas deepened the impact. American civilians, many with sons and brothers fighting in Europe, sent packages to camps holding German prisoners. Churches, civic groups, individuals, homemade cookies, candy, toiletries, games, books, writing materials. In towns near camps, civilians arrived with boxes of treats. Prisoners learned that these gifts were voluntary, unpaid, and motivated by religious or civic duty rather than state command. This was profoundly destabilizing. The regime they served had taught them that enemies were cruel by nature, that mercy was weakness. Yet here were Americans showing generosity toward men who had fought against their families. Strength expressed through restraint, power expressed through kindness. As labor shortages grew in 1944, captivity expanded beyond camp fences. German prisoners were sent to farms, orchards, canneries, and food processing plants. What they saw there dismantled the final defenses of belief. In Michigan, orchards, prisoners harvested cherries, not for survival, but for decoration. Tons of fruit, destined to garnish ice cream sundaes. Entire harvests devoted to something unnecessary: decorative abundance. In canneries, quality control lines rejected perfectly edible food for minor blemishes. Fruit diverted to animal feed because it failed cosmetic standards. German prisoners, raised in a culture where nothing edible was wasted, struggled to process what they were witnessing. This was not incompetence, it was surplus. Sugar beet farms in Colorado and Nebraska delivered another lesson: mechanized agriculture on a scale Germans had never seen. Single farms produced more sugar than entire regions of Europe. Prisoners understood now why sugar sat in open bowls at camp tables, why Coca-Cola flowed freely, why ice cream existed in wartime. They were not being indulged. They were seeing the output of an economy operating far above subsistence. Even American children became teachers. While working near towns, prisoners observed schools, organized lunches, milk served daily, protein, vegetables, bread. In some cafeterias, ice cream was available for purchase, children buying frozen desserts at school, while German children faced chronic hunger struck prisoners with brutal clarity. This was not elite privilege. This was ordinary life. When minimum security prisoners ate at roadside diners under guard, the lesson repeated itself. Menus offered variety that rivaled Germany's finest restaurants. Prices were modest, service was equal. Factory workers and executives ate side by side, ordering the same meals, paying the same prices. Social hierarchy dissolved at the counter. By 1944, many prisoners had access to American newspapers and magazines. Production statistics were published openly, sugar measured in millions of tons, milk in billions of gallons, chocolate in hundreds of millions of pounds, ice cream in volumes beyond imagination. These were not secret figures, they were public knowledge, casually reported. German production figures, when compared, were devastating. Even at its peak, Germany could not approach these numbers, and now, under bombardment and blockade, the gap was unbridgeable. The most psychologically destructive moment came quietly. By late 1944, German prisoners were no longer receiving food packages from home. Germany had nothing to send. Instead, prisoners began mailing food to their families. Using camp wages, they purchased American goods and sent them across the Atlantic. Chocolate, coffee, canned food. International Red Cross records confirmed the reversal. Millions of parcels flowed from American prison camps into a starving Reich. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Captive soldiers fed their families back home, using the surplus of the enemy they had been taught to despise. Freedom meant hunger, captivity meant abundance. American rationing made the contrast even sharper. Americans complained about sugar limits that exceeded German allowances several times over. Meat rations surpassed what Germans received in months. Even restricted, American consumption dwarfed German possibility. By spring 1945, newsreels sealed the lesson. German prisoners watched footage of American soldiers entering German cities, handing out chocolate and gum to children. Children laughing, smiling the same candy prisoners had eaten for years in captivity. The same abundance now extended to civilians of the defeated nation. The regime that promised triumph had delivered ruin. The enemy it demonized delivered food. When prisoners returned home between 1945 and 1946, the physical evidence was undeniable. Many had gained weight in captivity. Medical exams showed improved health. They returned to families thin, exhausted, and malnourished. Fathers who had eaten ice cream regularly, as prisoners brought chocolate bars home as treasures. Children who had forgotten the taste of sweetness learned it again from American candy. These men became reluctant witnesses. They spoke of a country that could fight a global war and still afford excess, a country where prosperity was not hoarded but normalized, where production created abundance instead of extracting it from others. Their testimony mattered. When American aid arrived under the Marshall Plan, many Germans accepted it because they had already seen proof that American wealth was real and renewable. Former prisoners applied what they had learned. Mass production, standardization, distribution, consumer abundance as political stability. The economic miracle of the 1950s did not emerge from ideology alone. It emerged from lessons learned in prison camps, delivered not through lectures but through meals. Coca-Cola returned to Germany as a symbol. Ice cream parlors modeled on American soda fountains appeared in cities. Supermarkets replaced scarcity-driven distribution. Former prisoners championed these changes because they understood them intimately. They had lived inside a system where abundance was normal. In interviews decades later, the memories remained sensory. The fizz of the first Coca-Cola, the cold shock of ice cream on a summer day, the weight of a Hershey bar in the hand. These experiences carried more persuasive power than any argument. They had tasted democracy, and it was sweet. The men who arrived in America believing in German superiority left as witnesses to something more powerful than conquest. A society so productive it could afford generosity, a system that defeated an ideology not by starving its enemies, but by feeding them better than their own state ever had. The war had been lost on battlefields, but the world view had been lost at the dinner table. By the final year of the war, the transformation was complete. What had begun as disbelief hardened into certainty. German prisoners no longer debated whether American abundance was staged or temporary. They understood now that it was systemic. It was the natural output of an economy organized around productivity logistics, and scale, rather than sacrifice and control. This realization carried consequences far beyond captivity. As prisoners followed the war's progress through newspapers and newsreels, the contrast sharpened. Germany's cities burned, transportation collapsed, rations shrank towards starvation levels. Meanwhile, American production numbers continued to rise. Factories expanded, farms mechanized further. Consumer goods never disappeared, they merely slowed. Even under rationing, Americans lived at levels Germans could not imagine even in peace. The psychological blow was final when prisoners grasped one unavoidable truth. American abundance was not dependent on conquest. Germany had stripped occupied Europe to feed itself, looted grain, confiscated livestock, seized factories, yet still failed to sustain its population. America, by contrast, fed allies, civilians, soldiers, and enemies simultaneously without pillage. Its wealth came from output, not extraction. This single insight shattered the moral foundation of Nazi ideology more effectively than any battlefield defeat. When liberation footage reached the camps, the lesson became irreversible. Prisoners watched American soldiers entering German towns, carrying chocolate, gum, and canned food. Children swarmed them, hands outstretched. The same Hershey bars prisoners bought for pocket change now brought joy to starving civilians. The enemy had arrived not only with rifles, but with abundance. Some prisoners recognized towns they had passed through years earlier, now reduced to rubble. Others saw children who resembled their own. The realization struck with brutal clarity. The state that promised strength had delivered hunger. The enemy it vilified delivered sustenance. Repatriation came slowly. Between 1945 and 1946, hundreds of thousands of prisoners returned to Germany. They arrived healthier than when they had been captured. Many carried Red Cross parcels filled with American food. Chocolate bars became family heirlooms. Coffee was brewed carefully, drop by drop. Canned goods were saved for holidays. These items were not luxuries. They were proof. Medical examinations confirmed what families already saw. Former prisoners had gained weight. Their teeth were healthier, their bodies stronger. Meanwhile, civilians who had endured the war at home were weakened by years of deprivation. Captivity had preserved life. Freedom had nearly destroyed it. The stories spread. Former prisoners spoke of ice cream served in summer heat, of Coca-Cola available everywhere, of sugar bowls left unattended, of waste that still shocked them years later. At first, these stories sounded like exaggerations, myths born of hunger. But as American aid flowed into Germany and supermarkets slowly filled, the tales were validated. These men became unlikely advocates for a new economic vision. They had seen that abundance stabilized societies, that consumer choice diffused resentment, that standardization increased quality, that productivity, not ideology, determined power. Many former prisoners entered business, logistics, and politics. They supported policies that emphasized production and distribution rather than control. Their memories of American camps informed decisions in boardrooms and ministries. The influence extended across generations. Children grew up hearing stories of prison camps where enemies ate ice cream, of guards who shared cigarettes, of civilians who sent Christmas cookies. These accounts shaped perceptions of America long before formal alliances did. When opportunities arose to study, trade, or work abroad, the pull was already there. The myth of American abundance, born in captivity, proved accurate. By the 1950s, the transformation was visible everywhere. Ice cream parlors dotted German cities. Soft drinks became commonplace. Supermarkets replaced ration cards. The economic miracle was not simply growth. It was normalization of abundance. Former prisoners recognized the pattern immediately. They had seen it before. Historians later confirmed what the prisoners had lived. Research into German POW experiences in the United States revealed that food abundance played a central role in ideological change. Formal re-education programs mattered less than daily observation. No lecture matched the power of 3 full meals. No pamphlet rivaled the impact of a 5-cent Coca-Cola. The numbers told the same story. Prisoners consumed over 3,000 calories a day. Sugar was plentiful, milk available, ice cream served regularly. German civilians survived on less than half that. These were not anecdotes. They were documented realities preserved in military records, Red Cross reports, and corporate archives. The men who returned home carried a revolutionary idea. Prosperity could be created, not enforced, not rationed into obedience. Created through productivity so immense it made generosity effortless. This understanding reshaped how they viewed power itself. Military strength mattered, but it rested on economic foundations, and those foundations were built not on fear, but on output. In later interviews, former prisoners returned again and again to sensory memory. The hiss of carbonation, the cold sweetness of ice cream, the weight of a chocolate bar in the hand. These experiences lingered because they were undeniable. They could not be argued away. They were lived truth. One veteran described his first Coca-Cola as tasting like the future. Another recalled realizing the war was lost not when Germany surrendered, but when he watched Americans throw away sugar he would have risked his life for. These moments defined transformation. The United States did not defeat Nazi ideology through starvation or indoctrination. It defeated it by demonstration, by showing that a democratic society could produce so much it could afford waste, that it could treat enemies with dignity without weakening itself. That freedom, when paired with industrial capacity, generated power no authoritarian system could match. The German prisoners, who experienced American abundance, became its most credible witnesses. They had arrived as enemies, they left as messengers, and the message they carried home was simple, devastating, and true. Democracy worked, and it tasted sweet.